You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic, famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere, nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. Goldbelly ships Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garden's famous cakes. So, if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT. That's goldbelly.com, promo code GIFT.
After the first newspaper articles recording the legend of Oak Island began to appear in Nova Scotia newspapers in the 1860s, or rather, perhaps because of them, interest in digging for treasure on Oak Island renewed. In 1861, another treasure company, the Oak Island Association, invested in the hunt. They made an effort to re-excavate the original money pit as well as to dig new shafts. During the course of their work, multiple wooden platforms they'd constructed collapsed, filling the bottom of the money pit with even more lumber that later digs would encounter and believe was sign of some treasure chamber or chests. During the last year of the Oak Island Association efforts, the diggings claimed their first known victim when a boiler on a pump engine exploded, killing one treasure hunter. Still, they worked on, attempting to dig down from the beach to cut off the theoretical flood tunnel, but failing since, as was thoroughly discussed in the previous installment of this series, there is no flood tunnel. After that company dissolved in failure, another formed in 1866, the Halifax Company, and again failed to shut the non-existent flood tunnels and found nothing but wood in the original shaft. Surely just pieces of the some 10,000 board feet of lumber estimated to have fallen in during previous digs. The lure of the legend was dormant then for a time, but in the late 1890s, it returned when a new group of treasure hunters descended on the island. This group used a boring apparatus once more and claimed to have brought up a piece of sheepskin parchment with the letters VI visible on it, written supposedly in India ink, a tantalizing find that would seem to indicate something old buried down below. Beyond this supposed find, however, no sign of a treasure was turned up. Instead, the Halifax Company turned its efforts to proving the existence of a flood tunnel by pouring red dye into the pit, after which they found indications of the dye off a few different beaches. In reality, if this even occurred, they had only unwittingly disproven the claim about a flood tunnel from Smith's Cove and proven that the diggings were flooded by a natural watercourse through which the dye had been dispersed, not just at the cove but into all the surrounding waters.
I recall reading that in the 1890s, somebody tried the dye trick, and it's just a natural hydrology.
That, again, is friend of the show, Dr. Sean Munger, who has graciously returned to talk with me more on the topic.
I always appreciate the opportunity to talk about these things, and I'm a big fan of your show, as you know, so great to be here.
You'll be hearing from him throughout the episode. This operation, too, resulted in the tragic death of one man who fell into a shaft. And, like all the others, it ended in failure. In 1909, another group, which included Franklin D. Roosevelt among them, tried to find treasure on the island, and the endeavors of this expedition, which called itself the Old Gold Salvage Group, sounding kind of like a Cash for Gold outfit with a bad cable TV commercial, would later be recorded in a Collier's Magazine article written by H.L. Bowden, a leader of the group. According to Bowden, he had seen the supposed inscribed stone and believed it had never been inscribed, and he had seen the scrap of parchment and believed it had not been brought up in the previous diggings. It would have been impossible, he said, for an augur to bring up parchment, or even links of chain for that matter, through 120 feet of water.
H.L. Bowden was the engineer on the 1909 dig. That's the one that Franklin Roosevelt was involved in. The inscribed stone that was supposedly found at the Oak Island site, he examined that stone and he said there were not and never were any markings on it. He explains in that article the various borings that they did at that time, and he concludes specifically that no links or parchment could have been brought up to the surface by a flat chisel or an auger because they were drilling through 120 feet of water. Bowden also stated that on their expedition, they definitely would have found any object down there greater than 2 feet square, and they didn't find anything, suggesting a chest or wood or anything like that. They found lots of limestone bedrock.
Despite the fact that still nothing was found, and a leader of the 1909 diggings even came out in a national magazine to assert that, quote, "there is not and never was a buried treasure on Oak Island," end quote, still the legend lured in others, and FDR was not the only well-known person to have taken an interest. Movie stars Errol Flynn and John Wayne would each be involved in organizing or funding a treasure hunting operation on the island. Mostly, though, the digs were spearheaded by true believers, self-styled treasure hunters who abandoned their lives and careers after reading a fascinating article in the press about the island, thereafter dedicating themselves to finding the buried treasure there, even buying land on the island and moving there, making it the whole of their life's work. After a 1928 article, two such men, William Chappell and Gilbert Hedden, came to live and work tirelessly on the island during the 1930s. They found nothing but a couple of axes and picks that were likely only further debris from previous digs. In the 1950s and 60s, it was the Restall family, whose efforts were described in the Reader's Digest article that captured the imaginations of so many, and they truly gave their lives over to the obsession. For Robert Restall, his 18-year-old son, and two others perished in a shaft after the release of poisonous hydrogen sulfide fumes. There was nothing supernatural about it. The release of poisonous gases happens when digging deeply underground. This was the purpose of the famous canary in the coal mine, to warn miners of such imminent dangers. Nevertheless, despite the commonplace nature of the danger, this tragedy spawned a further legend that the treasure on Oak Island was cursed. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and though I don't believe in the paranormal power of curses, I do think that the legend of the Money Pit is something of a curse on humanity, returning again and again, ruining lives through the decades, and like all curses, based on nothing but myth and superstition. Thanks for joining me for The Oak Island Scheme, Part 2, The Cursed Treasure Fraud. Before we start the episode, I want to thank my new patrons, Lisa McGuire, Daniel Hamilton, and Metal Man. Thanks so much to all of my patrons. Patrons of the show get access to a special feed with ad-free and exclusive episodes. I typically release a patron exclusive during each off week, making this a weekly podcast for patrons. For example, after my recent episode on pre-Columbian transoceanic contact theories, I released an exclusive about claims that Basque fishermen and a joint Danish-Portuguese expedition reached Newfoundland before the voyages of Columbus. And after the first part of this Oak Island series, I released an exclusive about the myths surrounding the naming of the Americas, which ties into some claims about Templars that I will be mentioning on this episode. If you hear the word minisode and think these are insubstantial little pieces, they're actually fully produced and researched episodes, usually around 10 to 15 minutes in length, and sometimes longer. Patron feeds also get episodes early, and like I said, their episodes aren't interrupted by advertisements or my Patreon promos like this one. So visit patreon.com/historicalblindness and support the show. Or you can support what I do with a one-time gift donation at historicalblindness.com/donate, or at the PayPal link in the show notes, or on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Now, on with the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. After the Reader's Digest article appeared and the legend was spread to a wide audience, a number of later treasure hunters appeared, moving to the island and spending the better part of their lives doing nothing more than digging, or even just poking around, looking for things on the surface that they imagined to be signs for where they should dig. That's right. By the later 20th century, people didn't even know where they should dig anymore. So many boreholes had been dug on the island that the original money pit's location had been lost. One such treasure hunter drawn to the island in the 1960s was Fred Nolan, and another was Dan Blankenship. Here's Dan talking about how he was drawn to the island in a CBC interview.
First time I heard about Oak Island, I read it in the January issue of Reader's Digest. It was only a short article, maybe 5 pages long. And I read it, and then I handed it to my wife, and I said, read it. And she did. And she, in so many words, she says, so what? And I said, as near as I can remember, I said, well, I believe there's treasure on Oak Island. And I believe that I'm going to be instrumental in finding it.
Both of these treasure hunters would leave their mark on the legend, but unsurprisingly, neither would find treasure. Blankenship managed to find a U-shaped wooden structure offshore of Smith's Cove, which he believed was part of the flood tunnel structure, but which was more likely part of the salt cooking operation it's now thought that fishermen conducted on the island. As for Nolan, his lasting contribution was Nolan's Cross, a series of boulders that he thought formed a cross if one connected the dots. Thinking it an X marks the spot situation, he dug beneath the center and found a rock that looked vaguely face-like, which he imagined had been carved, but which really just looks like a boulder. According to the legend, the cross formed by the boulders Nolan found was perfectly symmetrical. Though if you look at the diagrams that they use even on shows like the History Channel program, it's manifestly cockeyed. The fact is that a land survey in 1937 marked numerous boulders and piles of stones on the island. True believers have had to continually expand Nolan's Cross, suggesting it was a triangle or some other shape. With so many boulders on the island, it has now become a Kabbalistic tree of life in the eyes of some, with some 10 or 11 rocks they think were purposely placed there. Even as late as 2010, Dan Blankenship was finding more supposed landmarks and showing them to CBC reporters.
These are some of the monuments, I call them, that we've located when we were clear-cutting this area here. And in doing that, we located several of these, what I think are monuments, and they more or less, most of this particular type is triangular shaped, and they're deep, they're in the ground, and they don't move. I'll kick this one just to show you that they're solid, and they go down quite deep.
That's because it's a boulder. He's kicking a boulder in that clip. It's a big rock in the ground. They're all over the island, and really all over the coastline of Nova Scotia. The CBC long took an interest in Dan Blankenship. Before the History Channel program, he was certainly the most media-savvy proponent of treasure on the island. Back in the 90s, he was telling them about a new hole he intended to dig if he could just get the financing, swearing it would be his last effort.
Blankenship is planning the biggest dig yet. It's going to be an 80-foot in diameter hole, 235 feet deep. and it could cost as much as $10 million. So when does work start on the super hole, the 80-foot diameter hole?
Just as soon as we are successful in putting the financing together.
Will this be the end of it now? If you get the financing that you need and you dig that 80-foot hole and you don't find anything, would you see that as ending?
Oh, without a question. Without a question, I would see that as an ending.
So this is it?
It wasn't. And before that, in 1970, only 5 years after he'd come to the island, he got the CBC to come out and put a camera down one shaft he was working on into muddy waters. And in the murky and indiscernible footage that came back, he swore you could see not just tools like picks, but also treasure chests and even the skeletal hand of some human remains.
Right in behind it appears to be some kind of a chest or something. And if you look on the right-hand middle, it looks like a handle sticking out of it.
There is no handle visible. Looking at the grainy video today, all that can be seen are vague, mud-covered shapes and a piece of wood that is likely just debris that had fallen into the diggings. Every such find is easily explained as their imaginations running away with them, thinking maybe these rocks line up. Does that boulder look like a face? And pause, enhance, is that a treasure chest in this completely indiscernible film footage?
Absolutely. I mean, this whole phenomenon is the same thing as, seeing the Virgin Mary in a tortilla. I mean, it's that exact kind of pattern, and it's almost even worse with Oak Island, particularly the people who are heavily invested. Like you just mentioned a moment ago, people who have moved to the island or who bought property there or have, sunk their life savings into this. That's a sunk cost fallacy. So none of those people are going to go to the island and poke around a bit and then say, yeah, you know what, I don't think there's anything here. I mean, no one is going to do that. So if you're motivated particularly by a poor life decision to, go buy property on this island in the hopes that you're going to get rich treasure hunting, you're automatically predisposed to see the Virgin Mary in the tortilla you're looking at, because that's what you're looking for. This reminds me of, there was an interesting hunt before Robert Ballard discovered the wreck of the Titanic. There were several expeditions to try to go find the wreck. And there was a famous one. There was a Texas oil guy who spent millions of dollars on this boat to go out there and find the Titanic, and they never did. He got a team of scientists whom he did not listen to. There was one specific place in the ocean where they towed a camera underneath the boat on the ocean floor, and they saw something that they couldn't explain. It was some kind of shape or whatever in this very heavily silty water. And it was exactly the same thing as it sounds like the Oak Island videos are, where people are, squinting at the screen and saying, oh, well, gee, that looks like this or that looks like that. And there's really nothing there to look at. Of course, when the real Titanic was discovered, it was on a different site than the one that these guys had been towing their TV cameras around. So it was clearly not that. So I think similar things are going on here. There's people who have taken these videos and at great expense and difficulty and can't abide not seeing something there that they want to see. So again, Virgin Mary in a tortilla all the way down.
Now, since the premiere of the History Channel program in 2014, we have the Lagina brothers, Rick and Marty, a retired postal worker and former petroleum engineer, respectively, who, like so many before them, were inspired as children by the Reader's Digest story on Oak Island. Also, like so many before them, they sought some investment, figuring out a way to get paid, even if they didn't find any treasure. Taking Blankenship's lead, though, they saw the interest that the media and the public would take in their project. So rather than financiers seeking a stake in the treasure, they pitched a television program that would keep them in money so long as they could keep the dig going and keep up viewer interest with consistent, tantalizing finds. In fact, the money they would make from their reality TV program would taper and cease if they were ever actually to find the treasure. After a while, if one were to commit the masochistic act of actually watching it, it's very clear that those involved are just stringing the viewer along. Each season, they start focusing on some other geographical feature of the island. It's no longer about the money pit and the flood tunnels to the beach. Now it's about the stone landmarks and a swamp that is vaguely triangular in shape and a field of boulders that is in a quote-unquote quadrilateral shape. Of course, a quadrilateral is not a regular shape. It's an odd shape with 4 sides. But they clearly want to keep with their theme of finding imaginary geometrical patterns on the island. Beyond just rocks and swamps, they have turned up a few genuine artifacts. They discovered a jeweled brooch, a silver ring, a lead cross, a silver button, iron blacksmith tools, and a few coins. However, all of these were found on the surface, not hundreds of feet below ground. They are no more impressive than the findings of many a metal detectorist. There have been claims about the dating of these objects, that the button and ring are from the 18th century, the blacksmith tools dated to the 14th century, and that one of the coins was a Roman coin. Even if these were all true, it must be remembered that the island had been inhabited for centuries, and the objects could have been brought to the island at any time.
Basing some kind of vast theory on what seems to be a displaced artifact is kind of silly. Roman coins, I know, have been found in the Arctic, and they circulated to Inuit people through perfectly normal and explainable patterns of trade and contact throughout history. The fact that you found a Roman coin in Greenland does not require you to conclude that the Romans visited Greenland. That's not how it works. So, for example, I have a Byzantine coin on a shelf in my living room. Does that prove that the Emperor Justinian used to live in my apartment? No, it doesn't. So you see how ridiculous this is. The ground on Oak Island, both above and below ground, has been gone over so thoroughly over the last 200 years. And you can't really compare it. You can say, oh, what are the chances that a Roman coin would come up here? Well, have people dug in your backyard consistently for the last 200 years? If they did, what kind of things would they find? They would probably find a lot of stuff on every single property in America or Canada or anywhere else in the world. They would probably find a lot of stuff that you could squint at and say, well, gee, that's strange to find there. If you read about some of the archaeological discoveries they make in New York City, for example, almost every time when they're digging a new subway tunnel or they're doing some kind of infrastructure, they find something archaeological. They find human remains, they find artifacts from an 18th century tavern, or they find, this, that, or the other, because the property of New York has all been built so heavily that it's rarely been excavated. So you don't know what's down there. I think it's quite a stretch to try to make a theory out of some object that you find in a place and you say, oh, well, how could that have gotten there? Well, there's a whole lot of ways things could get there over time.
What many seem not to realize is that for any such artifacts to be meaningful, they would have to be uncovered in an undisturbed archaeological site by archaeologists who carefully document the context of the find. Without such scientific method, an artifact is just something that might have been brought to Oak Island as a hoax. Now for a brief intermission. Every summer, I'm careful to avoid getting burned. My summer plans always include applying sunscreen so I can attend barbecues and protests without worrying about getting scorched. And when I make my plans by making phone calls, I also don't want to get burned by an outrageous wireless bill. That's why I switched to a Mint mobile plan and saved enough to take a summer vacation. With Mint, I found no difference in speed or coverage, just a big difference in cost. And right now you can switch to a Mint wireless plan like me to avoid sweating those surprise charges and overages. You'll just be chillin' with Mint's offer of 3 months premium service on the nation's largest 5G network for just $15 a month. With high-speed data and unlimited talk and text, it might just be the coolest thing happening this summer. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/blindness. That's mintmobile.com/blindness. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. As listeners of Historical Blindness, you're no strangers to the fact that history is a lens through which we can better understand the present. Or as Shakespeare put it, what's past is prologue. History is the indispensable context without which we cannot hope to truly understand current events. You understand that, and so do the creators of the American Scandal podcast. Every season, they immerse listeners in the biggest controversies in U.S. history, helping us understand America's dark side and learn from its troubled past. Its latest season, Ruby Ridge Standoff, delves into an incident that sowed the seeds for the rise of the modern radical right. It transports you to 1992, where in a remote corner of Idaho, federal law enforcement surround a small cabin. They've come for Randy Weaver, a survivalist who took his family to the mountains in anticipation of the apocalypse. A simple weapons charge brought the agents here, but the situation is about to explode into a deadly and tragic standoff that will later become a rallying cry for far-right extremists, fueling distrust and violent anti-government sentiment for decades. Follow American Scandal on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes of American Scandal's Ruby Ridge Standoff early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus. Now, back to the show. A perfect example of this occurred in 2015, when it was claimed that a fisherman had discovered a Roman sword, not on but near Oak Island, while out scalloping. It was claimed that this fisherman had found the sword years earlier, and fearing some legal reprisal for having illegally recovered a historical artifact, had been secretly keeping it until he decided to bring it to the producers of the History Channel's Oak Island program. And one odd character who had appeared on the program previously, J. Hutton Pulitzer, who calls himself a, quote, treasure force commander, end quote, and wears a wannabe Indiana Jones outfit, vouched for the sword, saying he had personally confirmed its authenticity with scientific testing. If such a find were true, it was argued that it proved claims about ancient Roman mariners having crossed the Atlantic in antiquity, reaching the shores of the Americas. But as I discussed in my previous series, there have been a few hoaxes perpetrated as evidence of ancient Roman contact with the Americas, including the Tucson artifacts and the fake Roman amphorae sunk in a bay near Rio de Janeiro. And even if the sword were authentic, the lack of provenance, the lack of evidence regarding the context in which it was found, means that it could just be an authentic artifact brought to Oak Island in the modern day. However, the strange design of the sword, which featured a carved Hercules figure as its handle, which would be a very awkward handle indeed, put skeptics on guard, and a few began to write about this, including Jason Colavito and archaeologist Andy White, who is known for exposing pseudo-archaeology. As Swordgate, as the scandal was thereafter dubbed, unfolded, more and more such swords struck from the same mold were brought to light, and analysis of these swords, as well as the one supposedly found near Oak Island, proved they were nothing but modern souvenirs produced to be sold to tourists outside Pompeii, and that the molds were used to forge numerous other fake Hercules swords.
This was a real belly laugh moment. They found the Roman sword, and then it was determined most likely that it was a toy sold in a gift shop from Italy in the 70s, the 1970s. I know there was some metallurgical analysis on it. It's modern alloys, very remarkably modern alloys. The guy Pulitzer, his involvement in this, I think, virtually proves that it's a scam.
Commander J. Hutton Pulitzer would not relent. Though even the History Channel program declared it a modern object, he suggested that there was some cover-up. He rallied his social media followers to harass skeptics who questioned him. He threatened legal action against his debunkers and encouraged conspiracy theories that they weren't even real people. Naturally, Pulitzer himself became a figure of interest to these and other skeptics. His name is actually Jeffrey Filyaw, a former marketing guy who rebranded himself numerous times, first as an inventor, next as an entrepreneur, then as a treasure hunter, and most recently as an election integrity expert. His invention, the Q-Cat, a cat-shaped handheld device for scanning barcodes that would pull up web pages, had been a widely ridiculed failure and the reason for changing his name. His entrepreneurial venture was selling bottled rainwater and was likewise a failure. And after his ignominious treasure hunting career, he most recently appeared in the public eye making false claims about hacking the Georgia voting system, supporting former President Trump's lies about election fraud.
After the Swordgate folly, he turned up again, hawking claims that the 2020 election was stolen, and that he had some super secret paper analysis process that he invented that would prove it. Of course, it did not prove it.
To the History Channel's credit, they declared the sword modern.
It's interesting that there are some standards, as far as History Channel goes, ancient aliens, hunting Hitler, that's fine. But even they can't get behind the toy sword from the gift shop being a Roman artifact on Oak Island.
But Pulitzer's presence on the program before the sword's appearance itself demonstrates the program's lack of credibility, as well as how cranks are drawn to the legend of Oak Island, fully prepared to endorse hoaxes in order to support their own wild theories. Certainly the myths and crank notions that some try to attach to the Oak Island legend are many. Though the History Channel program was honest enough to admit that J. Hutton Pulitzer's Roman sword was a fake, they also heavily featured his baseless speculation that it was the Ark of the Covenant buried in the money pit.
This is about history. And the bottom of this hole is going to be some of the most important pieces of treasure to mankind. We're talking about the Ark of the Covenant.
The Ark of the Covenant?
Meanwhile, there's some guy in that church in Ethiopia that's going, "What are you talking about?"
And while Pulitzer favored the notion that ancient mariners had brought this treasure across the Atlantic from the Holy Land, others have claimed that later mariners did the same. More specifically, that the dun-dun-dun Knights Templar brought treasure they had unearthed from the Temple Mount across the ocean to Oak Island. I don't think the mic picked it up, but it's storming here right now, and there was actually a clap of thunder as I said that while I was recording this.
It's pure conjecture. It's just nonsense. And it sort of comes from the almost, and I think you hit the nail on the head, the almost reflexive desire to spin historical conspiracy theories about the Templars. I recalled that Umberto Eco, one of my favorite authors, poked fun at this tendency in his novel Foucault's Pendulum, which if you haven't read, you really should. It's a very sardonic and erudite satire on conspiracy theories. And in this book, the main characters play a game assisted by a computer. This was written in the 80s. They play a game of making up elaborate conspiracy theories. And one of the rules of the game is the Knights Templar are involved with everything. So Foucault's Pendulum was published in 1988. Eco, of course, died in 2016. But do you imagine how hard he'd be rolling his eyes if he could see how spot on his satirical take was?
Now, I've erected some scaffolding here, so I need not refute the entirety of this legend. In the previous series, I already examined in detail the idea of Templar persistence after their order's suppression, as well as claims about escape from France with treasure, or escape to Scotland, and their supposed connection with Henry Sinclair, whom some speculate crossed the Atlantic. None of it is convincingly supported, not their persistence, nor their escape with treasure, nor any presence in Scotland, nor any connection with Sinclair, and neither is there any support for the assertion that Henry Sinclair undertook a transatlantic voyage. In a recent patron exclusive, I further examined and refuted unsupported claims that Templars learned of a star called America that ancient mariners had recorded would lead them to a land called La America. It's all based on sources that were imaginary, or at least that we have no reason to believe really existed, appearing only in the breathless fantasies of pseudo-historians. And yet, the History Channel's Oak Island program promoted these myths time and time again. The boulders Fred Nolan thought were arranged in a cross must be a Templar cross. The lead crucifix found on the island, another Templar cross, though it is not the flared Templar cross symbol they wore on their mantles, and thus is just a cross. On one old and weathered coin they found that is too beaten and aged to be identified by numismatists, they claim can be discerned a Templar cross, and it can sort of be seen, I think. But this does not make it a Templar coin, as they claim. In fact, Templars did not mint their own coins. Any coin closely associated with their order in the Holy Land would have been issued in the name of the King of Jerusalem, not in the name of their religious order. And the simple fact is that the cross seen on the coin, which is so often called the Templar cross, is actually just the cross patty, or footed cross, in that its arms were narrower in the center and curved out to broad ends. It is perhaps better known today as the Iron Cross of the German Empire. This cross, or a variation of it like the footed cross potent, appeared on numerous coins, including Spanish and Portuguese coins. So even if this is a footed cross on the coin found on Oak Island, it's really only of interest to rare historical coin collectors, not Templar historians.
It's nonsense, of course. Why would anyone believe that they had anything to do with treasure buried on an island in Canada, considering they ceased to exist in 1307? It's really silly. Very, very silly.
Equally unsupported are the claims of Templar infiltration of Freemasonry. It is a striking parallel to the later unsupported conspiracy claims about the Bavarian Illuminati infiltrating Freemasonry, except for the very important fact that Freemasonry as we know it did not exist at the time of the Templar Order's dissolution. Imagined connections between Templars and Scotland have led to speculation about the Scottish rite of Freemasonry being Templars in disguise, though it must be remembered that Templars were comprised mostly of French-speaking soldiers who certainly would have stuck out in medieval Scotland, and the lodges of speculative Freemasonry, the kind we think of today with their odd rituals and leisurely gentleman memberships, didn't appear until 400 years after the Templars were suppressed. In London, not Scotland. The Scottish brand of Freemasonry would only appear some 20 years later, as close as we can reckon, based on the first mentions of it. It spread because of how popular Freemasonry became in that era. But conspiracists will say Nova Scotia means New Scotland, so it must be Masonic, though Scotland is not synonymous with Masonic. And they'll say that since the early Nova Scotia councilmen were Masons, this shows that Nova Scotia had a Masonic government.
Oh my God!
But the fact is that many civic-minded men of that era were in Masonic lodges, as it was simply de rigueur. As for Oak Island, conspiracists point to the supposed inscribed code on the stone found in the pit.
You mean the inscription that did not exist?
Which, as I've said, may never have existed, or if it did, may not have even been inscribed.
Yeah, that one.
And claim it may have been a Masonic code. Or they look at the supposed landmarks on the island for geometrical patterns they can discern as Masonic.
Given everything that leads to this kind of speculation is the same sort of, the stones line up in the shape of a cross. That just seems a really slender hook to hang anything on.
Interestingly, skeptics too see a Masonic connection here, but not one that suggests there really is anything buried on Oak Island. Renowned skeptic Joe Nickel, examining the story of the money pit's discovery as it appeared in 1860s newspaper accounts, has pointed out that multiple aspects of the tale, the presence of the three boys seeing signs and discovering the hiding place, matches in key regards with the Masonic allegory of the secret vault, in which three sojourners discover a secret crypt into which King Solomon had deposited secret wisdom, an allegory used in the initiation ritual into the Royal Arch degree of Freemasonry, typically granted to 3 initiates at a time. Nichols' point, of course, is that the whole story might have been a winking prank, meant only to be understood by other Masons reading the newspaper, perhaps indicating only that McInnes, Vaughan, and Smith received the Royal Arch degree.
I mean, I understand where Joe Nickel is coming from, and I think it's certainly more plausible that it was a prank than it is that it's real. But I still don't believe it's really a prank. I think it's just all sort of squinting at boulders and trying to see something there that's not there. Although I'll admit that the idea that it's a Masonic prank is much more plausible than the notion that there's actually buried treasure there. And it could be that it wasn't, it was a prank intended to just satirize people's tendency to see Virgin Mary in a tortilla type of reasoning.
Despite his conclusions, though, Nichols' observations only pour fuel on the fire of conspiracism, as theorists suggest that these parallels only mean Masons are responsible for hiding some kind of treasure on the island.
Of course.
There is no shortage of theories regarding who buried something on Oak Island and what that something is. One version promoted in the book Dr. Munger first read the legend in was that the British had hidden their soldiers' payroll there during the Revolution, a theory that can be superficially supported whenever some old colonial-era button turns up.
As I recall, the article in that book tried to make the claim that the treasure was actually money that had been brought by the British Army during the American Revolution and hidden on Oak Island as a pay station or something, which makes no sense whatsoever if you know anything about the American Revolution or the British Army or the history of Canada. It makes zero sense. Okay, so we're gonna send the entire British Army to Oak Island in Nova Scotia, far away from where the fighting was at the end of the Revolutionary War in 1780, where it was mostly in the South. So we're gonna send the entire British Army to Oak Island, where we're gonna have them line up and go single file across this island to get paid for their service, and then we're gonna ferry them on a boat back to England. Like, this is nonsense. It's just nonsense.
Dan Blankenship liked the rather mundane notion that some rogue Spaniards had stashed some of their loot before heading home, thinking to keep for themselves some of the treasure meant for royal coffers. Of course, when a Spanish coin turned up, it was claimed as evidence for this theory.
Who's to say that a bunch of captains didn't get together and say, hey, we're taking all the risk and we're sailing these ships heavily laden with gold and silver back to Spain, and given to and adding to the king's coffers. And let's start stashing some of this away for our own use. I like the idea that a bunch of Spanish captains got together.
I like the idea. Who's to say? No facts, just feelings. According to some reports, Franklin Roosevelt's group favored the idea that Marie Antoinette's jewels had been buried on the island, smuggled out of Versailles by a lady-in-waiting, according to an apocryphal story. So when a brooch turned up on the island, it is touted as proof of this theory.
And here we get back to displaced artifacts. The Byzantine coin in my apartment. It wasn't left there by Emperor Justinian.
One really outrageous theory is that the original manuscripts of Shakespeare's plays await discovery deep beneath Oak Island, and the bit of parchment supposedly, but not really, discovered underground was confirmation of it. Here's William Shatner, of all people, speculating about it on the History Channel program.
The mystery that intrigues me is the possibility that Shakespeare's papers, if he was written by Sir Francis Bacon, might be buried somewhere. What do you think about that and his papers? And I mean, that's almost unanswerable.
Almost unanswerable, indeed.
How can you take a tiny bit of parchment, which is not proven to be a real discovery anyway, and then you extrapolate from that Shakespeare's plays are buried on Oak Island? I mean, that's insanity. It's like saying that I found a tiny scrap of paper on the floor of my office, and that proves that the original manuscript of James Joyce's Ulysses must be hidden under the carpet. It's that kind of leap. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever, especially considering the fact that the Shakespeare authorship conspiracy theories, and you have to buy into those before you get to, they must be buried on Oak Island.
This ties in with claims about the authorship of Shakespeare and the idea that his plays were actually written by polymath Francis Bacon. Simple logic would tell us it would be absurd for such lengths to be taken to hide manuscripts of some comedies and dramas, even if they were originals that somehow revealed their true authorship, because who would have cared that much about it?
Yeah. Like it doesn't make any. Why would you bury Shakespeare's plays? It makes no sense at all.
But conspiracists bend over backward, suggesting that Francis was a Rosicrucian, that he wrote codes and hints into Shakespeare's plays, that these clues lead to Oak Island, on which he buried not his plays, but rather other ancient documents and manuscripts of great importance, and that he devised the cipher on the inscribed stone himself. But remember, there's no evidence that any cipher ever really was inscribed on the stone, as extant drawings of it appear to be fake. Also recall that the piece of parchment supposedly turned up probably never was. H.L. Bowden, in his Collier's magazine piece, after stating that no auger could pull up a scrap of parchment through 120 feet of water, also says that the scrap of parchment was not found at first when soil samples were examined, but only later, implying it may have been planted as a hoax.
There is such a hunger for these wild theories, and especially when you get something like the History Channel show that traffics in that's their stock and trade. That's where they make all their money and where they focus all their business. You're going to churn up everything. Shakespeare is going to come into it, and the Knights Templar are going to come into it, and UFOs and aliens are going to come into it, and Marie Antoinette, of course, and the Russian royal family is probably going to be involved at some point. It's nonsense. It's just utter nonsense.
While all of these spiraling conspiracies and tall tales are manifestly incredible, we must remember that the legend of Oak Island has always relied on a fantastical story. It all started with the original tall tale of buried pirate treasure, specifically the treasure of Captain Kidd. Now for a brief intermission.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
Grit is in you. It's in your passion, your perseverance. It's in every challenge you face and overcome. Grit is in you. It's never in Rockin' Protein. Never settle.
Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
Now, back to the show. The legend of Captain Kidd's buried treasure animated many a treasure hunter in the New England area for more than a century. Ironically, as more and more has been learned about Kidd, it has become clearer that Kidd did not bury vast caches of looted money, as had long been thought. William Kidd was a character shrouded in myth for a very long time. Though he started as a privateer and pirate hunter, he became viewed by many as a vicious pirate and murderer himself, leading eventually to his trial and execution. But he may have received a bad rap. As a young man, he had apprenticed aboard pirate ships, crewed by both Englishmen like himself and Frenchmen. And after participating in a mutiny, he became a ship captain. But despite whatever piratical adventures he was involved with in his youth, he made his name fighting against the French in the 9 Years' War, not only in the Caribbean but also off the coasts of New England. He was an active member of society in New York City, helping to finance the building of Trinity Church and marrying a wealthy widow. In 1695, he left on his final voyage to hunt pirates and French warships under a letter of marque signed by King William III of England. But almost immediately he began to earn a bad reputation. When his ship encountered a Navy yacht, his crew didn't salute them but rather slapped their backsides instead. And in retaliation, the Navy pressed a large number of his crew into service, even though this was illegal, since his letter of marque excluded them from impressment. Indeed, this would not be the first time that the Royal Navy would attempt to force his crewmen into service. And at a later date, Captain Kidd resolved the matter by promising to deliver the men but leaving port in the middle of the night. Thus, among the Royal Navy, he began early in his final voyage to take on the reputation of a pirate. Kidd's voyage, which would take his ship all the way around the Cape of Good Hope to the Indian Ocean, where pirate ships preyed on the rich merchant vessels of the Mughal Empire, would be troubled by disease and rumblings of mutiny. Having not encountered any prizes they could legally take, one gunner urged Kidd to attack a Dutch ship, which would have been illegal. When Kidd refused, the sailor reportedly cursed him and made some mutinous remarks, whereupon Kidd struck him on the head with a bucket. The sailor died the next day, and this incident would later come back to haunt Kidd. Despite what later legends would claim, Captain William Kidd was not very successful in taking prizes during his voyages in the Indian Ocean. But he did take a couple of merchant ships, and he took them legally, for they sailed under the protection of the French, and Kidd kept the sea pass documents to prove it. However, because the captain of one ship was English, and because the cargo of another belonged to an official in the Mughal court, and because the political tides had turned against Kidd back in England, he was officially declared a pirate, and English men of war were dispatched to hunt him down. In 1698, the Piracy Act kicked off a campaign to arrest and prosecute pirates, but it also presented the possibility of a royal pardon to pirates who turned themselves in. However, Captain Kidd was explicitly excluded, so when it became clear that he had no choice but to turn himself in, he felt he had to take precautions, hiding one of his prizes and burying his loot. This is the origin of the buried treasure legend. While it's true that Captain Kidd did bury some of his looted goods ahead of his arrest, the legends have inflated how much he buried and what he buried. In truth, the bulk of what would be considered treasure that he took from his meager prizes was composed of sugar, opium, and fabrics like silk, not gold and silver. And it is even known where he buried it, on Gardiner's Island near Long Island. This cache was soon afterward found and taken to England as evidence in his trial. Kidd found that even his former allies had turned against him, as he had become an embarrassment. At his trial, he was surprised to find he was charged with the murder of his crewmen with a bucket, as ship captains were typically granted much leeway regarding the discipline of crewmen and mutineers. And when it was asserted that his capture of a certain ship was an act of piracy, he discovered that his evidence, the sea passes that proved the ship was sailing under French protection, had been conveniently lost. Kidd was hanged twice because the first time didn't do the trick, and afterward his corpse was gibbeted, hung in a cage over the River Thames as a warning to pirates. Throughout the 19th century, though, legend of his buried treasure would continue to animate many treasure hunters and serve as the foundation for many buried treasure legends, including the earliest claims about Oak Island. In the 20th century, though, the documentation that could have exonerated Kidd was discovered, showing he was more privateer and pirate hunter than pirate. And in 2007, the wreckage of the merchant ship he had hidden away was discovered near a small island off the coast of the Dominican Republic.
Pirates of the Caribbean is the stuff that movies are made of, but at Indiana University, it is the real thing. An Indiana University underwater archaeology team is confident that it has found Captain Kidd's last pirate ship off the coast of the Dominican Republic.
Underwater archaeologists assert that there is no sign that the wreck had previously been looted, and yet there was also no treasure aboard her, beyond historical artifacts, like a cannon. That's because Kidd was likely not so rich in treasure as legend would claim, and most everything he hid away was likely soon after recovered, if not by authorities, as has been asserted, then by the pirates who helped him bury it. In the absence of fact, however, legend flourishes, and there are always characters who will take advantage of that. With the rumors of Captain Kidd's treasure so popular, a new class of treasure hunting mystics arose in New England and all up the North Atlantic coast, including in Nova Scotia. These men presented themselves as magicians, or rather seers. Some of the earliest of them claimed to be able to find buried treasure with dowsing rods. These are the witch hazel rods often said to be capable of finding the location of water underground. So-called rodsmen would help farmers find the best spot to dig a well, and before long, they were also helping to find buried treasure. However, according to these mystics, the treasure Captain Kidd or Blackbeard or whoever had left behind was not so easily obtained. Actually, these treasures were cursed, they claimed, guarded by the spirits of dead pirates, or perhaps demons or witches or other spirit guardians.
You know, what you're describing is your classic Scooby-Doo plot. This type of legend is the blueprint for Scooby-Doo. I mean, it is. It's just where it came from.
And if certain mystical rites were not followed exactly, such as the drawing of magic circles and symbols around the site, and the sacrifice of an animal offering, if these and other requirements were not met, the treasure would actually be spirited away, moved underground to some other location. People really believed this nonsense, and we know it because there exists a wealth of documentation, much of it in the form of legal proceedings, as these treasure hunters were considered disorderly persons, scamming those who helped them dig. Many of these treasure hunters were known counterfeiters. They would bury their bogus monies and pretend to find it as a form of money laundering. But once you had earned a reputation by this or some other means of being able to find buried money, you no longer needed to actually find anything. The way the scam worked was you would collect investment funds, get sacrificial livestock donated that you could afterward use for meat, and collect actual money from those you promised a stake in the treasure. Then you would make claims about magic circles and digging only at night, and declare that no one must utter a word within the circle, lest it wake the treasure's guardian. Then all they had to do was wait until some impatient digger broke the rule, voicing their frustration, or until the morning light came, and they could claim the dig had failed and the guardian had whisked their treasure away. This may seem absurd, but it's true. We know it's true because of documentation preserved specifically because it is of interest to Mormon scholars. You see, Joseph Smith, who would later go on to found Mormonism, used to be one of these treasure hunting scammers. He came from a family of rodsmen, and eventually he would claim to be in possession of a seer stone, a little rock that showed him where buried treasure was. Joseph Smith, too, would be prosecuted for his treasure hunting frauds. And eventually, he would make a different claim, that he had discovered inscribed gold plates, and that his seer stone allowed him to translate them, thereby composing the Book of Mormon and transitioning from treasure hunter to prophet. What does this have to do with Oak Island, you might be asking? Think it through and you'll see that it leads us to the most logical and rational explanation for what's really behind the legend of a cursed treasure on Oak Island. Like many of the treasures that con men claimed to be leading digs to find, it started as a claim about pirate treasure, even specifically kids' treasure. The legends about Captain Kidd's treasure would inspire many a popular fiction story, like Edgar Allan Poe's The Gold Bug and Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, and the original stories about the treasure's discovery, about 3 boys finding signs of buried treasure on an island haunted by pirate ghosts, bear a suspicious likeness to these popular tales.
The Oak Island legend has a lot of similarities with some literature, like specifically Treasure Island or The Gold Bug, both of which I mentioned in my video series. Poe and Stevenson were writing from the literary and folklore background that they knew. These stories were very, very popular, especially in the mid-19th century. These kinds of stories were very popular just in folklore, particularly on the Atlantic coast and in New England and in places that, British America that eventually became the United States and Canada. Particularly the Gold Bug, if you notice structurally, all the things in the story have analogs in the Oak Island legend. And the one that sticks out to me is the discovery by children, because the main character of the Gold Bug is a young boy. So many of these legends involve children finding or children seeing something that adults either couldn't see or didn't believe. Again, Scooby-Doo. That's the Scooby-Doo plot. Is these heroic kids are going to the haunted house that all the adults have written off, and they found what's really there, and it turns out to be fake.
Likewise, treasure hunting scammers typically kept stringing their diggers and investors along, by pointing to any little thing they might find in their diggings, like a piece of wood or an odd stone, claiming it was a sign or quote-unquote mark that they were close to the treasure or on the right path. Joseph Smith's seer stone itself was a stone that turned up in a well digging that he claimed had supernatural faculties. And likewise, the tales of the tackle block in the tree, the depression in the ground, the pick marks in the pit, the wooden platforms, the inscribed stones. There is no evidence that these existed, but they are just the sorts of telltale marks that treasure hunter scammers would claim.
Just suppose for the sake of argument that in the 1840s or 50s or 60s you were trying to scam people into investing in a treasure hunt. How would the story have to be told? First, you would need an origin story, something that, whets the appetite for, there's got to be something there. But then you would also need an account of a treasure dig that had occurred earlier, made some very tantalizing discoveries, but ultimately failed. It's been tried before, they didn't have the right equipment, they didn't do whatever, but look what they did find that proves that there's something there.
And they would always be just about to get the treasure when something would go wrong and the guardian would prevent their discovery. Think of the claims about being just near the treasure chest when the flood tunnel filled the pit. Indeed, this is what has made the Oak Island legend have lasting power. Rather than a story of demons and spirits guarding buried treasure, it's the equally false claim that a flood tunnel booby trap is what prevents the treasure from being recovered.
This is the point I make in my video series. The reason why this legend has legs in the modern world, where the previous legends that it resembled, which are, you mentioned one a moment ago, the idea that there's treasure and there's a ghost that's guarding the treasure, or it's cursed. It's exactly the Scooby-Doo story. So only a person who's uniquely virtuous can break the curse and get the treasure. So there were a whole bunch of those kinds of stories in the 18th to 19th century. This one is the same story, but it's got a slight the gene bends a little different way. Whereas instead of a ghost guarding the treasure, it's something that is at least theoretically possible in the real world. Which is this, we've discussed that it's not really possible when you drill into it, but on the surface, the idea, there's a booby trap, there's, some kind of engineering works that are preventing you from getting this treasure. That's the mechanism in the story that prevents you from getting the treasure. In the old legends, the mechanism was the ghost or the curse. If any of those ghost or curse stories were told today, we would recognize them immediately as folklore. It's like, that's just a story. But because this one has a little piece in it that is at least theoretically plausible, this is the story that has survived when all the ghost and curse stories have been forgotten.
This lends the tale more believability in the modern world, but at its heart, the scam is the same. Go back to the original 1860s newspaper articles, and specifically the Oak Island Folly, and we see that it's a story of investors losing money in the venture because the promised treasure is never found. Yes, this is what makes the name the Money Pit so ironic, because it's just a sinkhole into which people throw their money and never get anything back. But when we start to see that this is by design, it takes on ever starker meaning. The Onslow Company. What was that but a treasure dig based on a false claim in which Simeon Linz, the Nova Scotian who it was said organized it, was either scammed himself or was the scammer of his investors? And the same can be said of the Truro Syndicate later, and perhaps the Oak Island Association and the Halifax Company. Each dig coming oh so close, supposedly, to getting that treasure, but only uncovering supposed signs of it, the platforms, the inscribed stone, the gold links, the parchment scraps, only to be stymied by the guardian of the treasure, the flood tunnel. But where they had failed, perhaps the next company would succeed, and you could have a share of the treasure too, for just a small investment in the operation.
Conceptually, I think this legend is similar in some ways, and this is going to be a weird analogy, but it's similar in some ways to the Shroud of Turin. It's an example of a phenomenon that was very, very common in the past, but it seems exotic and noteworthy to us in the modern world. simply because it happens to be one of the only examples of that once common phenomenon that has survived into the modern world. So what I mean by that is the medieval world was littered with numerous artifacts of Christ, including there were several burial sheets, pieces of cloth said to be the burial sheet of Christ. But because only one somehow managed to survive all the centuries, and that one is the one that has come to be called the Shroud of Turin, it's easier for modern people to think, well, that must be the genuine one because there are no others that we're aware of. Same thing happened with this story. Buried treasure and pirate legends, they were a dime a dozen back in the 18th, 19th, early 20th century. Probably every port, every island on the Atlantic had a buried treasure legend attached to it. A couple of those stories made their way into literature that has survived into modern times, like the Gold Bug or Treasure Island, but most of those stories have been forgotten. So again, this is the Shroud of Turin. This is the last hardy survivor of all of those stories. And it's kind of like it's sort of the unfrozen caveman lawyer of these types of stories, where it just accidentally has gotten frozen in time and transmitted down to the modern world. But it's no different than those stories were, and it was just a story.
So it begins to look like, at its heart, it was only ever a kind of Ponzi scheme. As time went on, even the organizers may have been true believers and dupes of the legend, but it is still only a scam. And the presence of known scammers like J. Hutton Pulitzer attests to this fact.
I think Oak Island is a fairly small-scale scam that by a complete accident of history has become a legend that people have told for hundreds of years. And I don't think it ever started out that way. There were probably a couple of scammers somewhere in Canada around the Nova Scotia area who had heard some stories about buried treasure on an island. And so they came up with a way to scam some investors out of some money. And they probably either succeeded or they failed, but they moved on to something else. And then someone else heard from someone that this thing had happened. And so then it got told again, and then it morphed and became a slightly different legend told by somebody else, and then was appropriated by other scammers later on in the 19th century. And so it just kept getting recycled.
Today, the most recent group of investors to be scammed have been the audience, who invested their time and imagination in the History Channel program.
What the History Channel is doing is a scam. They're essentially reinventing the scam, recycling the scam from the 1850s or 60s, and they've just put it into digital form, but it's still the same scam. It's, as you said, it's not people investing. I mean, there's advertisers investing money, that's for sure. So are the viewers the ultimate victims or the advertisers? I don't know, but somebody's making money from perpetuating this legend that by a complete fluke of history has legs beyond the other kinds of legends that it resembles.
I have no doubt that History Channel programmers, and perhaps even the Lagina brothers themselves, did not believe that a treasure would be found on the island, but they still sold it to viewers every week and enjoyed the financial rewards it brought for 11 seasons. Just like the treasure con men of yore, they pointed to every rock and piece of wood as a sure sign they were on to something, and they filled their investors' heads with all kinds of fanciful stories of treasure, and each season, each episode, they left on a cliffhanger, pretending they were right on top of that treasure. Tune in next week to see them finally dig it up.
I can understand why they're so desperate to find these sorts of things, because after 11 seasons, they've got to show something on screen. So if you think about this conceptually, how exciting is a reality show about people who never find what they're looking for? I mean, that's the premise of the show. You know ahead of time they're not going to find the treasure. If they found anything substantial, it would be on the news before the show even gets on the air. And the History Channel can't ask people to watch a blank screen every week, although I think they would if they thought they could get away with it. So the whole aim of the show is to present as little as possible while playing up to the greatest extent they can the speculative nature of whatever it is they're finding.
It's an age-old scam, and it works so long as no one really thinks too hard on it. if one does, as we've seen, there are countless ways the legend falls apart. But the most fundamental problem, lying at the bottom of the money pit like bedrock, is the simple flaw in the logic of the entire conceit. If treasure of any sort were buried on Oak Island, first, it would not have been so elaborately buried. This has been pointed out already, that the excavation of slender, narrow flood tunnels from Smith's Cove to the money pit would have required moving all the earth between the cove and the pit. Perhaps such a narrow channel could have been dug by a small burrowing animal, but not humans with crude hand tools, and the cove was not even the closest shore to the pit, so it would not have made sense to tunnel or drill horizontally in that direction. Not to mention what a feat it would have been to dig so deeply and set up the wooden platforms. We must remember that even according to the legend, diggers with hand tools could only get so far before they had to rely on horse-driven augers to drill more deeply. And today they rely on modern coring drills. Are we really to believe that 16th century seamen or ancient mariners were able to accomplish this without such equipment? Beyond that, why would they need to bury their treasure so deeply and elaborately on a deserted island? This is never adequately explained. Why not just bury their chests 20 feet down, as would be perfectly sufficient to hide anything? Nor is it ever explained why they did not return for their treasure. Surely if they took such efforts to hide it, they would have come back for it, even if one or several of them had died or was arrested or was otherwise detained.
It doesn't make any sense. If you think about this logically, why bury treasure in the first place? There are genuine examples of buried treasure, like hoards of coins found in Europe. One of the examples that springs to mind, there were Jews who were being persecuted in pogroms, particularly around the Black Death era of the Middle Ages, who often buried large amounts of coins or silverware or whatever. I know in Roman Britain, as like Roman authority was crumbling in Britain, there are several hoards of coins found in England that sort of follow the same pattern. So the people who bury treasure are people who want to prevent their goods from being stolen or confiscated. There's a live threat, there's an imminent threat, which they expect or at least hope will pass so that they can go back and get their stuff when the danger has passed. That's why you bury treasure. So if any of the usual suspects in this legend actually buried treasure on Oak Island, Knights Templar, Captain Kidd, Francis Bacon, Shakespeare, I'm sure Shakespeare was out there with a shovel, why on earth would they do this in the first place? That's your first problem. Why? What possible sense would it make to bury treasure? But even if you get past that gate, why would they leave it there? If it was done for whatever unfathomable reason, why would they not have gone back to get it? Just assume for the sake of argument that there was something buried there. Why would you assume that it's still there? That whoever buried it abandoned the treasure for all time and never went back for it? In fact, the more fabulously valuable that you suppose the treasure must be, the stronger the incentive is to go back and get it at some point. Which means if it was ever there, which of course we highly doubt that it ever was, but if it ever was there, clearly it is not there anymore. And if you mention this to someone who believes in the Oak Island legend, instantly they'll start conjuring excuses out of thin air as to why, well, maybe they were pirates and they were captured, or maybe this or that. But they don't really get that there's several layers of conjecture here. I mean, you never seem to realize that there's no evidence that the treasure was ever buried in the first place, and there's no reason for anyone to have buried it. Why was this done? Nobody seems interested in that question. Why was it done in the first place? If somebody did bury treasure on this obscure island and then went back to get it after some temporary danger had passed, why wouldn't they just dig down, grab your treasure, and just leave a big open pit in the ground? And then if 200 years later somebody comes across the open pit you left, it's not as if they're going to be able to say, oh, gee, I think treasure was buried here once. So it's even more far-fetched to believe that someone buried their treasure, then came back for it, got it, and then concealed all traces that treasure had ever been buried there, for whatever unfathomable reason they would want to conceal that.
and let's imagine what that recovery would look like. If it were true that the treasure was somehow buried so deeply below ground that modern equipment was needed to get to it, and whenever you came near it, a booby trap filled the diggings with water, preventing any access to it, then how could they have hoped to recover it themselves? If the legend is to be believed, then treasure was not buried on the island. It was destroyed there, made impossible to recover.
Either way, you would never find treasure there no matter how deep you dig or how long you look. So, when is it safe to give up on Oak Island? After how many digs have failed to find anything? When do you conclude that there's no treasure left to find? I mean, what possible hope could there be left after all of this time? Apparently, after 200 years of digging, that's not enough for some people. Because if you think about this logically, each dig that attempts and then fails to find treasure is more proof that it is not there and never was. Each one would have made it easier to find if there was something there. Each successive dig, even if they failed, would have made it easier to eventually locate it, not harder. If you think of what the History Channel is doing, if one season of the History Channel show ends with no treasure being found, why would you renew the show? Why do you think that another season of digging is the one that's going to do it? And if 2 seasons aren't enough to conclude that there's nothing there, is it safe after 10 seasons to declare failure and give up for all time? So, when is enough? When do we prove that there's no treasure there? And for the believers, the answer is always never. So there's the old adage, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That's not accurate in this case. Absence of evidence is evidence of absence here. There's the saying, well, you can't prove a negative. Actually, you can. You really can prove a negative. I think it has been proven that there is no treasure on Oak Island. I think that's been proven over and over and over and over again for the last 200 years. So I think the historical record is very clear that there is no and never was treasure there.
There is a term coined by skeptic Mark Hufnagel called crank magnetism. It's the idea that belief in one fringe idea, like pseudoscience, conspiracy speculation, or pseudo-history, leads to belief in others, because crank ideas attract each other. Dr. Hufnagel uses this concept when describing denialism, for example, which often must resort to claims of conspiracy in order to make its claims. But we see this phenomenon all over the place. It's why QAnon has exploded into a dozen conspiratorial directions, and why believers in the lost Tartarian Empire have been led inevitably to belief in giants. It's why the Knights Templar and Atlantis always pop up, as we have seen again and again. It's no mystery then why the old legend of Oak Island, a pretty simple pirate treasure story likely used to dupe unsuspecting investors into a treasure hunting scheme, has become so insanely vast in its conspiratorial implications, with ancient Roman contact with the Americas, hidden religious artifacts, Templars and Rosicrucians and Masons all figuring into its legend.
When my series came out, there was either a blog commenter or a YouTube commenter, I'll never forget this specific comment, said that I must carry a heavy cross of pessimism and I must live a miserable life because I don't believe in a completely baseless 19th century scam about buried treasure. And it just goes to show you the will to believe in this kind of thing against all evidence, against all reason, is very, very strong, and people will never be disabused of that will to believe. So those of us who actually do care about historical methods and research and documentation are kind of barking up the wrong tree, because I think the people who believe in this legend are playing a completely different ballgame than we're playing.
The cult of treasure hunting in New England always relied on fantastical ideas to fire the imaginations of those who would pay to search for treasure. This tendency of mystics claiming in this region to be capable of supernatural insight would lead to a great many other dubious beliefs. Joseph Smith parlayed it into an extremely successful modern religion. And not far from where Smith got his start, the Fox sisters would pull off something very similar, claiming through ritual and paranormal faculties to be able to interact with the spirits of the dead, and thereby fooling the world into the very popular belief in spiritualism. When viewed in this perspective, the belief in a cursed treasure has led in the past, through crank magnetism, to a variety of massive frauds and delusions. It should be no great surprise, then, that one treasure fraud, that of buried treasure on Oak Island, would survive the old scams, and through the accretion of numerous complementary legends and myths promoted on bad cable reality TV and in the darker corners of the internet where conspiracy delusion and pseudo-history thrive, would become a modern myth whose perceived mystery many have devoted and lost their lives to solving. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. Thank you to our guest, friend of the show, Dr. Sean Munger. Go check out Dr. Sean Munger's videos on YouTube, his podcasts, Second Decade and Green Screen, and his blog at Garden of Memory, as well as his online courses at seanmunger.com.
Yes, and I'm slowly going to be revamping those over the next couple of months. So, there's a couple of free courses on there, including one of the free courses is on the Holy Grail, which we talked about in a previous episode. There's also one on Pearl Harbor, which I think is a really fun class and is one of my most popular ones.
And his novels on Amazon Kindle.
I have a book, a fictional book that's out now, or it's out for pre-order now. It's called Daniel Vanished. It's a mystery. So it is up for pre-order on Amazon Kindle. It comes out April 16th, and there will be a paperback version available at that time as well. So it sort of comes from the world of cold missing persons cases. If anyone has any interest in that, it was fun to write.
And check out my historical novel about Joseph Smith and about Freemasonry in America, called Manuscript Found, also on Amazon Kindle. In it, I dramatize Smith's treasure hunting scams in a hopefully entertaining fashion. Check out the blog post for this episode, which should go up on historicalblindness.com before the next episode releases, with a transcript, related imagery, and citations for further reading. As always, thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Robert Fisher, Joe Escott, Sean Munger, Devlin Hoff, Michael Markham, Jessica Reeves, Fred R. Groteis, Robin Naggett, Rebecca, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliet O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Logan Houlihan, Lily Powers, John Gowen, Lonnie Coffer, Ralph Fenn, Emma, Kevin Osborne, Ed Shockley, Benny Slater, That One Girl, Jocelyn Clausen, and Lindsay McAllister. Thank you all for investing in my dig. As promised, I will lead you to the location of where the most interesting finds in history can be dug up. And along the way, I will help interpret the signs we see. But you must beware, when we really dig into it, there may be nothing there at all. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and The Conspirators. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes, or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, remember, keep digging, my friends, and you must remain absolutely silent during this podcast. If you break the silence, you break my spell. You'll miss important clues and then you'll be lost. I mean, of course, you could rewind a little, I guess, if you miss something, or you could listen again. So I guess it's not. I mean, you can talk during it. I don't know. I don't know what I'm saying.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel like wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely? That's what I like to call redacted history. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
Spend less time staying in the know about all things gaming and more time actually watching and playing what you want with the IGN Daily Update podcast. All you need is a few minutes to hear the latest from IGN on the world of video games, movies, and television with news, previews, and reviews. So listen and subscribe to the IGN Daily Update wherever you get your podcasts. That's the IGN Daily Update, wherever you get your podcasts.